Hello, and welcome to Space Historians, where curiosity drifts softly through the quiet hours of the night. I'm truly glad you're here, ready to slow down, to breathe a little deeper, and to let your thoughts sink gently beneath the surface of the day. Tonight, we're not gazing toward the stars. We're turning our attention inward, downward, into the silent waters of our own planet, to a place so deep, so strange, that even light itself cannot reach it. The Mariana Trench, Earth's deepest abyss. As you listen, there's nothing you need to do. Let the world around you fade for a while. Feel the rhythm of your breathing, the steady rise and fall, like the waves that have rolled over these depths for millions of years. Imagine the surface of the ocean stretched endlessly before you, calm and silver in the moonlight. You stand at the edge, where water meets land, and the air smells faintly of salt and distance. Every sound, the wind, the slow lap of waves reminds you that beneath this tranquil surface lies another world. A world few have ever seen, and even fewer have touched. If you enjoy these quiet explorations through science and story, you can help this small corner of calm reach others who might need it too, with a like, a share, or a simple subscribe. It means a lot more than you might think. And for those who've already joined this gentle community of listeners, thank you. You are part of this voyage, part of the wonder that keeps it alive. Now, picture the ocean floor beneath you, layer upon layer, falling away into twilight, the bright shallows where coral and fish shimmer in the sun, the dim blue zone where light fades and shadows deepen, and then the darkness, the realm of silence, where pressure builds like the weight of worlds. If you could keep descending, hour after hour, you'd eventually reach a vast wound in the planet's crust, deeper than Mount Everest is tall, colder than the polar seas, and older than every city ever built by human hands. That is where we're heading tonight, not with ships or submarines, but with imagination and calm. We'll drift together through the story of this trench, how it was found, how it was measured, and what strange forms of life have claimed it as home. Along the way, we'll meet explorers who dared to descend into its blackness, scientists who mapped its hidden curves, and the silent creatures that glow softly in the dark. The journey will be slow, soothing, and filled with wonder. So, if you're listening in bed, close your eyes. If you're awake somewhere far from the sea, just listen to the quiet between each word. The ocean has always been a mirror for the mind, vast, deep, and filled with mystery. And tonight, we'll drift into its deepest secret. Welcome to Science for Sleep. Welcome to the quiet world beneath the waves. For as long as humankind has stood by the edge of the sea, we have wondered what lies beneath. The ocean has always been more than water. It has been a mirror for our imagination, a restless, unknowable realm that both sustains and swallows life. Sailors feared it, poets worshipped it, scientists measured it, but no one truly understood how deep its silence ran. For most of history, the ocean was already enough of a mystery. Its vastness inspired myths, serpents coiling around ships, whirlpools dragging fleets into oblivion, gods stirring storms with their hands. To ancient navigators, the horizon was not an end, but a question. How far could the sea fall before it met the bones of the earth? No one could have imagined the answer would be deeper than mountains are tall. Beneath the Pacific, east of the Philippines, and south of Japan, there lies a wound in the crust of the planet, a scar more than 1,500 miles long. It is the Mariana Trench, the deepest place on Earth. Its floor drops nearly 11 kilometers below sea level, into a darkness so absolute that sunlight has never touched it. If Mount Everest were dropped into its depths, its snowy summit would still rest more than a mile beneath the waves. Think of that, the tallest mountain on Earth, swallowed completely by water. The numbers alone strain belief. 36,000 feet, 1,000 times the pressure of the air around us, temperatures near freezing, and silence so thick it feels like a presence. And yet, impossibly, life exists there. Small creatures glow softly in the dark, their own bodies carrying the only light for miles in any direction. For centuries, no one knew this abyss existed. The earliest maps left blank the deep parts of the ocean, decorating them with dragons and sea monsters. The unknown was terrifying, but it was also sacred, a place where imagination filled the gaps that instruments could not. Humanity was content to gaze outward at the stars, believing the heavens were the true final frontier, never realizing that beneath their own ships was a world just as alien. Then came the age of soundings. Sailors began lowering ropes weighted with iron or lead, hoping to touch bottom. They let the line slip through their hands for hours, until the fibers burned their palms, and still the rope vanished into the black. When it returned, it came back wet, stretched, and wordless. The ocean had answered, but in silence. In the late 1800s, a British vessel called HMS Challenger was sent to explore the depths of the sea. It carried over 200 miles of rope, thermometers, dredges, and nets. On one of its soundings, the rope fell and fell 8,000 meters before striking bottom. The crew stared in disbelief. It was a depth beyond reason, a number that no one thought possible. That single reading whispered of a world that human eyes had never seen, a place where the planet itself bent inward. The spot would later earn the name Challenger Deep, the lowest point known on Earth. From that moment, everything changed. The ocean, it was no longer a mystery without measure. It was a frontier, silent, waiting, and unimaginably deep. When you pause to think about it, the Mariana Trench is a contradiction made real. It is both absence and abundance, both void and life. It is the planet turned inside out, the unseen foundation beneath the noise of waves. It humbles even the most advanced technology, reminding us that the Earth still holds secrets too vast to fully grasp. And perhaps that is why it continues to fascinate us, because in a world mapped, measured, and named, there remains one place that refuses to yield a quiet, crushing darkness that swallows certainty whole. The impossible beginning of the Mariana Trench is not just a story of discovery. It is a story of awe, of standing at the edge of knowledge and realizing how small we are before the depths, of learning that sometimes, to find the greatest mysteries, we must look not upward to the stars, but downward, into the blue-black silence beneath our own feet. Long before anyone thought to measure the ocean, humanity stood at its edge and wondered. The sea was the oldest mystery, stretching farther than sight and deeper than imagination. It breathed in tides, whispered in storms, and glimmered with secrets. For millennia, it was both cradle and boundary, a horizon that marked the end of the known world. Picture a shoreline thousands of years ago. There are no satellites, no compasses, no maps, just firelight flickering on wet sand, the sound of waves rolling endlessly, and the dark water beyond vast, untamed, unknowable. To early sailors, the ocean was a living thing, a force of moods and tempers. It could offer food or take lives without warning. They saw faces in the waves, tempests as anger, calm seas as grace. Every culture shaped its own stories to explain what could not be seen. To the Greeks, the sea belonged to Poseidon, unpredictable and powerful. The Polynesians saw it as a celestial pathway, guided by stars and swells. In the cold north, Norse myths spoke of Jormungandr, a serpent coiled around the world beneath the waves. And in countless other traditions, the sea was both god and monster, a mirror of fear and faith. For the ancients, the deep ocean was not just distant, it was unreachable. Their ships clung to coastlines, tracing the edges of continents. Beyond the horizon lay a blank expanse where dragons and chaos waited. The phrase here, "be monsters," was not simply poetic, it was practical. The ocean's darkness was literal and symbolic, a reminder of how fragile the known world really was. It wasn't ignorance that kept people from the depths. It was scale. Even the simplest attempt to measure the sea felt impossible. A sailor might tie a weight to a rope, lower it over the side, and wait. The rope would vanish into the water, drawn downward until it ran out, or snapped, or returned with nothing but cold mud. They could measure a harbour or a bay, but not the open sea. Beyond a few hundred meters, the depths remained unknowable. And yet, curiosity persisted. Humans are rarely content with mystery for long. As navigation improved, so did the desire to understand what lay below. By the 16th century, explorers crossed oceans to find new lands, but the waters themselves remained unmapped. When early cartographers inked their scrolls, they could fill every continent with detail, mountains, rivers, cities, yet the oceans remained vast, pale emptiness. The uncharted space was terrifying, but it was also magnetic. The mind rushes to fill silence. The Mariana Trench waited through all of this. It lay far from trade routes and coasts, hidden beneath a quiet corner of the Pacific. While civilizations rose and fell, while empires mapped continents and invented telescopes to study the heavens, the deepest scar on Earth rested unseen. No story reached it, no myth named it, no sailor felt its pull. It simply existed, a silent fold in the planet's skin. The irony is that humanity looked to the sky long before it looked beneath its own waters. People could dream of the moon, but not the abyss beneath their ships. The sea seemed endless enough without imagining that it had a bottom deeper than mountains are tall. For thousands of years, the ocean floor might as well have been another planet. Still, each wave that broke on every shore carried a hint of that unseen world. Every tide pulled at human curiosity, whispering that there was more, that the horizon was not the end, only the beginning. And one day, centuries later, those whispers would turn into questions, and questions into instruments, and instruments into discovery. But for now, in this early chapter of history, the trench remained untouched, hidden beneath the ordinary motion of waves. The sailors saw only the surface, the poets only the reflection, the gods only the mystery. Beneath them, the planet's deepest secrets slept in silence, waiting for the first human hand to measure its fall. It began with a rope, a weight, and patience. The year was 1875. The ship was the HMS Challenger, a British naval vessel repurposed for science. Its mission was simple but unprecedented to measure the deep. It sailed the oceans for nearly 4 years, crossing every major sea, dropping weighted lines and recording temperatures, salinity, and depths. But on one quiet day in the Western Pacific, something extraordinary happened. The crew gathered on deck beneath a hazy morning sky. The air was still, the sea a mirror. They prepared their instruments, nothing more than a spool of line, heavy sinkers, and a simple mechanical register to record the depth. To most of the men aboard, it was routine. They had done this hundreds of times before, but as the line uncoiled, slipping through their hands, something felt different. The rope fell for minutes, then hours, until the spool creaked and the coil nearly emptied. Finally, it struck bottom. When they calculated the measurement, the number stunned them more than 8,000 meters deep. Deeper than anything ever recorded. At first, they assumed it must be an error. Perhaps the line had drifted sideways. Perhaps a current had pulled it taut before it touched the seafloor. But the reading was consistent, the temperature data matched, and the instruments were sound. The ship's chief scientist, Charles Wyville Thompson, double-checked every calculation. There was no mistake. They had found a point in the Earth's crust so deep it defied comprehension. They marked the location simply on their charts, a depression east of the Mariana Islands, a single point in a vast ocean known to no one. The men did not realize it then, but they had just discovered the deepest place on the planet. In their journals, the scientists wrote about the astonishing depth and the strange feeling of looking into infinity. One officer described it as staring into a hole in the world. The ship's log noted the reading plainly, but between those lines lay a sense of quiet awe. What they had found was not just a measurement. It was a threshold, a place where the known world ended. News of the Challenger expedition spread slowly, carried by letters and scientific papers. The numbers seemed unreal to most readers. 8,000 meters was a distance people could not easily imagine. It was taller than the Himalayas were high. It was deeper than myth. Over time, new soundings confirmed the truth. Later expeditions in the 20th century, the German ship Planet in 1951, and the American survey vessel Vityaz measured even deeper points, eventually reaching nearly 11,000 meters. The location was named Challenger Deep, in honor of the ship that first revealed it. With each measurement, the ocean seemed to grow larger, darker, more mysterious. Scientists began to wonder what could survive down there. The pressure at that depth is immense, more than 8 tons per square inch. Any air-filled chamber would collapse instantly. Even steel could buckle. And yet, samples brought up from those depths contained microscopic life. Tiny organisms that had adapted to pressures that would crush nearly anything else. For the first time, humanity realized that life was not limited by sunlight or surface. It could endure in the dark, in the cold, underweight, unimaginable. The ocean was no longer a void. It was alive, even at its lowest point. The Challenger expedition did not have cameras or submarines, only ropes and resolve. But in that one sounding, they cracked open the surface of the world. What they revealed was a doorway, a glimpse into the planet's most hidden realm. And so, from that day forward, the Mariana Trench was no longer just a mythic abyss. It was a real place, measurable, charted, and yet still impossibly distant. The discovery reshaped how humanity saw its own planet. For beneath all the maps and continents, there was still mystery, a reminder that the world we stand on is deeper, older, and stranger than we ever dared to believe. When the readings from the HMS Challenger first reached Europe, the world of science didn't erupt with excitement. It paused. Then it argued. The number more than 8,000 meters was almost too large to believe. It meant that somewhere on this planet, the seafloor plunged deeper than any mountain rose. To many, that simply couldn't be true. The Royal Society in London reviewed the data carefully. The calculations seemed sound, the instruments precise. Yet, doubt hung heavy in the air. Even the most disciplined minds found it hard to imagine a depth so extreme. The press, meanwhile, treated it with equal parts awe and skepticism. Some newspapers called it a hole to the center of the earth. Others dismissed it as human error, a measurement distorted by current or storm. But the ocean does not exaggerate. It waits quietly while people debate its truth. As reports trickled in from the Challenger expedition, the public's imagination caught fire. Artists began to sketch monstrous abysses and giant creatures rising from black water. Preachers called it proof of creation's mystery. Sailors swapped stories of trenches so deep they could swallow ships whole. For centuries, the sea had belonged to myth, and now science had drawn a line through that myth, yet somehow made it even more mysterious. In lecture halls across Britain, students gathered to hear Professor Wyville Thompson describe the expedition. He spoke not as a man who had conquered the ocean, but as one humbled by it. He showed samples of mud collected from miles below the surface, fine, grey sediment that told of ages beyond comprehension. And though his voice was calm, his words carried reverence. "It is," he said softly, "a world without light, without heat, and yet not without life." Still, disbelief lingered. Some scientists argued that the instruments must have been faulty, that the rope had drifted or tangled. They questioned whether any place could truly be that deep. It wasn't until later soundings confirmed similar results that the argument began to fade. Yet even then, the idea of such an abyss unsettled people. It wasn't just the depth. It was what it implied that the planet itself contained regions utterly beyond reach, vast and silent, immune to exploration. Meanwhile, outside academia, the public response grew stranger. Poets began to write of the throat of the earth, where the planet swallowed dreams. Newspapers compared it to the gates of hell. Painters imagined landscapes of eternal twilight, where whales drifted like ghosts. The trench became a symbol of wonder to some, of dread to others. For the sailors who had taken the measurements, it was simpler. They remembered the stillness of the sea that day, how the line had slipped endlessly downward, and how every man on deck had fallen silent when it struck bottom. There had been no celebration, no cheer, only a shared understanding that they had touched something ancient, something that existed long before humanity and would endure long after. As months passed, the initial shock softened into reflection. The discovery of the Mariana Trench began to shift how people thought about the planet. The Earth was no longer a perfect sphere of solid ground and shallow sea. It was a dynamic, folded, fragile shell, bending under its own weight. The discovery of such a depth hinted at forces unseen tectonic movements, subduction zones, the living geology of a restless planet. In the quiet of laboratories and libraries, scientists began to piece together a new truth, that the sea floor was not fixed, but alive with motion, and that the trench, that vast black wound beneath the Pacific, was the deepest scar of all. Yet beneath all the data and analysis, one feeling remained: awe. A wordless, humbling awe. Humanity had measured the ocean and found in its depths not just numbers, but perspective. Because to glimpse the deepest point of Earth is to be reminded of our own smallness, to understand that even here, on our own world, there are places we will never fully know. Every great discovery carries its own paradox, and the Mariana Trench was no exception. For the scientists who had uncovered its existence, the trench represented progress proof that the human mind could measure even the most hidden corners of the earth. But for the world beyond their laboratories, it became something else entirely. The deeper they looked, the less they seemed to understand. Science thrives on clarity, yet the trench offered only obscurity. The more data researchers gathered, the stranger the story became. Instruments spoke of pressures that should have crushed all life, yet samples returned with traces of microscopic organisms. The seafloor was supposed to be barren, but tiny shells and fossils revealed a history of life, even at impossible depths. Each answer opened two new questions. In academic journals, debate unfolded with a kind of reverent confusion. Was the trench simply a geological accident, the result of one tectonic plate sliding beneath another, or was it something more mysterious? Some theorized it was a wound from the planet's formation, a scar left by the violent birth of continents. Others suggested it was still shifting, still growing, a reminder that Earth itself was alive. But outside the halls of science, imagination filled the gaps once more. Writers and storytellers painted the trench as an abyss of secrets, a gate to the underworld, even a resting place for forgotten civilizations. The contradiction was irresistible. The same place that defined the limits of science also ignited the fires of myth. As research continued, scientists found themselves caught between wonder and reason. They wanted to study, to map, to quantify. Yet each new expedition returned with more mystery than certainty. Samples taken from the depths contained strange isotopes, organic compounds, and unknown species. The mud retrieved from the seafloor shimmered faintly, as if flecked with hidden minerals that defied explanation. And though the instruments recorded no light, something perhaps bioluminescent organisms occasionally flickered in the darkness below. For the public, it was irresistible. Newspapers mixed fact and fantasy freely, reporting that creatures the size of whales might live there, unseen for millions of years. Religious leaders quoted scripture, warning that the ocean's depths were places not meant for humankind. Meanwhile, oceanographers found themselves accused of hubris, of trespassing into the divine unknown. Even within science, a quiet divide emerged. Some researchers insisted that all mysteries could be explained with time and technology. Others believed that the trench represented something larger, a boundary beyond which human understanding might always fail. It was a philosophical rift disguised as scientific disagreement. In a letter written during the 1920s, oceanographer John Murray confessed, "We have peered into the abyss and found the limits of our courage, not our instruments." It was an admission that data could only go so far, that beyond the numbers there was a kind of spiritual vertigo that no chart could measure. The contradiction deepened when explorers began to imagine what it might take to descend into that darkness. Every calculation revealed new impossibilities. A human body would be crushed instantly. A submarine, even one built of the strongest steel, would implode long before reaching the bottom. The trench seemed to mock human ambition, a silent frontier that demanded humility. And yet, that same resistance only strengthened the will to know. Each generation of scientists carried the contradiction forward, the tension between the measurable and the unknowable, between knowledge and awe. It is the paradox that defines every great frontier, that the closer we come to understanding, the more the mystery grows. The Mariana Trench was no longer just a depth in the ocean. It was a mirror held up to human nature, reflecting both our intellect and our longing, our precision and our poetry. It showed that science and mystery are not enemies, but companions. One seeks to illuminate, the other to remind us that darkness has its place. In the end, perhaps the greatest contradiction of all was this, that in seeking to measure the abyss, humanity discovered not the limits of the earth, but the limits of itself. After the disbelief faded, curiosity took its place. If the ocean could reach such depths, then someone, someday, would have to see it with their own eyes. The Mariana Trench had shifted from rumour to measurement, and from measurement to challenge. For the new generation of scientists and explorers, it became a question that demanded pursuit. How far could humanity truly go into the deep? In the early 20th century, that pursuit began quietly. The tools of exploration were still crude, heavy ropes, primitive sonar, fragile glass thermometers lowered into darkness. But even those simple instruments whispered secrets back from the abyss. Sound waves returned from impossible distances. Temperature sensors revealed cold beyond anything felt at the surface. And sometimes, the mud they pulled up from the seafloor contained something extraordinary. Faint traces of life. The discovery was unsettling and inspiring all at once. If organisms could survive at pressures more than 1,000 times that of the air above, then life itself was far more adaptable than anyone had imagined. Oceanographers began to see the trench not as an end, but as a beginning, a doorway into understanding the resilience of existence. By the 1950s, technology had caught up with imagination. The world's oceans were being mapped with sonar, and the outlines of the Mariana Trench came into sharper focus, a long, narrow crescent curving through the floor of the Pacific. At its deepest point, the sonar pulses took nearly 14 seconds to return. That echo told a simple, haunting truth. No place on Earth was deeper. The investigation turned global. Nations poured resources into ocean science, each driven by a mix of curiosity and quiet competition. The Cold War had pushed humans to explore the skies, but now some turned their gaze downward, seeking the last untouched frontier on Earth. The United States and Switzerland began designing a vessel capable of enduring the pressure, a small steel sphere that would become the most daring craft ever built. The bathyscaphe Trieste. Led by Swiss engineer Auguste Piccard and later joined by his son Jacques, the Trieste was a strange creation, part balloon, part submarine. It used gasoline for buoyancy, because gasoline was lighter than water and incompressible under pressure. Beneath its floating body hung a steel sphere barely big enough for 2 men, with windows no larger than dinner plates. Inside that sphere, explorers would trust their lives to physics, courage, and luck. In 1960, the world watched as the Trieste was towed to a quiet spot above the Mariana Trench. The ocean was calm, the air still. On board were Jacques Piccard and U.S. Navy Lieutenant Don Walsh, 2 men about to become the first humans to descend into the planet's deepest place. The dive took nearly 5 hours. As the Trieste sank, its outer hull creaked and groaned under the mounting pressure. Each kilometre deeper meant an invisible weight building on every square inch of metal. They watched as the light faded, blue giving way to black. The temperature dropped, the cabin walls flexed, bolts strained. Still, they continued downward. At 10,000 meters, a loud crack rang through the sphere. One of the outer viewing panes had fractured. Both men froze. If the inner layer gave way, they would be crushed instantly. But the structure held. Slowly, carefully, they continued the descent. Finally, after nearly 7 hours, they reached the bottom 10,916 meters below the surface. The Trieste landed softly on the ocean floor, stirring a cloud of fine sediment that took minutes to settle. When it cleared, the explorers stared out through the thick window into an alien landscape. The seafloor was pale and flat, scattered with fragments of rock. And then, movement, a small creature, like a flat fish, drifting across the light of their lamps. In that moment, everything changed again. Life existed even here, at the edge of crushing pressure, where sunlight had never been. The men stayed for barely 20 minutes before beginning their long ascent. When they broke the surface, they carried no treasure, no relics, only the knowledge that humanity had reached its own abyss and returned. The investigation was complete, yet it had only just begun. What they found at the bottom of the world wasn't simply depth, it was endurance of the planet, of life, of curiosity itself. When the Trieste surfaced on that grey morning in 1960, it brought back more than just two men. It carried fragments of a new world, the first true data from the bottom of Earth's deepest abyss. No one had ever seen such readings before. Temperature, pressure, density, and faint traces of life pulled from a place where life should not exist. In the days that followed, scientists crowded around the retrieved instruments like archaeologists studying relics from another age. The Trieste's logs recorded a pressure of more than 16,000 pounds per square inch. The temperature was just above freezing. The density of the water was higher than anywhere else on Earth. Every line of data told the same story, that the deep ocean was not a still, empty void, but a dynamic, breathing environment governed by strange laws of its own. But it was the samples that changed everything. When the dredge was examined, it revealed fine, pale sediment filled with microscopic organisms. Single-celled foraminifera, delicate shells crushed into powder by weight and time, still carried evidence of organic carbon. Some samples even glowed faintly under certain wavelengths of light. A whisper of bioluminescence trapped in the mud. The discovery stunned the scientific world. It meant that life could endure in conditions once thought impossible without sunlight, under pressure that would flatten any air-filled body, and in temperatures close to zero. This realization echoed far beyond oceanography. It reshaped biology, geology, and even astronomy. If life could exist here, then perhaps it could exist anywhere under the ice of Europa, in the methane lakes of Titan, or beneath the surface of Mars. Each clue pulled the trench further into the story of existence itself. The mud was analyzed for isotopes, revealing traces of elements that hinted at constant movement, tectonic plates colliding, recycling the planet's crust over millions of years. In that grey dust lay evidence of earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and ocean currents so deep and slow they could take centuries to complete a single cycle. But as the data grew, so did the mystery. Instruments lowered into the trench often malfunctioned. Some returned crushed, their casings warped by pressure. Others vanished completely, as if swallowed by the black. Sonar readings sometimes revealed odd reflections, shapes that moved and then disappeared. For every fragment of truth recovered, another slipped away. To the scientists, this was not discouraging. It was exhilarating. The trench was alive with puzzles. Each incomplete record, each strange reading, was an invitation to look deeper. The Pacific, it seemed, was not silent at all. It hummed faintly with seismic energy, with the movements of unseen tides and drifting life forms too fragile to name. New expeditions followed. Japan, the United States, and Russia began sending unmanned probes into the depths. These machines, fitted with cameras and robotic arms, recorded the first flickering images of the abyssal plains. The footage was grainy, ghost-like faint lights drifting in blackness, pale creatures swimming slowly through clouds of sediment. One Japanese probe captured an image that would haunt scientists for years: a translucent snailfish hovering above the seafloor, its fins fluttering like wings, its body pulsing with inner light. It was fragile, elegant, and utterly alien. The photograph proved that life at the bottom of the trench was not just possible, but thriving in its own quiet way. The Mariana Trench, once a number on a chart, had become a living world. Each new piece of data was a fragment of that reality, a clue written in pressure and time. And yet, for all its precision, the science could not capture the feeling of the place. Numbers could describe the cold, the darkness, the crushing force, but they could not express the silence, the weight of being so far removed from everything familiar. That silence was its own kind of truth, one that could not be recorded, only imagined. So, the data continued to arrive, year after year, fragments of a world beneath the world. Each expedition brought back a little more light, a few more clues, a deeper understanding of the living planet. And still, the trench waited, its secrets unfolding one by one, each as fragile and profound as the first grain of mud lifted from its floor. Every new discovery about the Mariana Trench seemed to create not clarity, but division. The deeper scientists looked, the more uncertain they became. Data poured in from probes and expeditions, readings of crushing pressures, icy temperatures, and microbial life that defied explanation. Yet when those facts reached the world's universities and research journals, they scattered like fragments of a broken mirror. One school of thought saw the trench as a purely geological phenomenon, the inevitable consequence of tectonic plates colliding in slow, grinding motion. According to this view, the Pacific Plate was sliding beneath the smaller Mariana Plate, dragging the seafloor down into the planet's mantle. It was the Earth recycling itself, an ancient process written in stone and pressure. To these scientists, the trench was the ultimate expression of natural law, not mystery. But others weren't satisfied with that simplicity. Some marine biologists argued that the trench held unique conditions, chemical gradients, mineral vents, and deep water currents that made it a cradle for strange and ancient life. They proposed that these depths might resemble the early Earth, a living fossil of the planet's beginnings. In their view, to study the trench was to peer back through time, to the first breath of biology itself. There were even those who went further, crossing the thin line between speculation and philosophy. They wondered if the trench, with its silence and darkness, might not be a place of creation, but of return, a vast digestive organ in the living body of the planet, where matter, energy, and time dissolve together. These were not ideas that fit neatly into textbooks, but they stirred imaginations across disciplines. The public, too, found their own meanings. The media loved to dramatize the debate. Scientists baffled by the world beneath the world. Documentaries spoke of alien ecosystems. Novelists and filmmakers turned the trench into a stage for stories of ancient creatures, hidden civilizations, or even gateways into the unknown. The more the experts disagreed, the more the legend grew. Yet within the laboratories, the arguments were quieter and more profound. Some scientists clung to what they could measure. Others leaned toward what they could feel. The Mariana Trench sat at the center of that divide, an abyss of both data and doubt. Each new sample seemed to argue with the last. The chemical composition of the sediment hinted at volcanic activity, yet seismic sensors found silence. Sonar maps showed walls that appeared to move over time, as if breathing. Pressure sensors occasionally recorded sudden fluctuations, small but real, the ocean itself flexing like a pulse. Some saw these irregularities as errors, others saw patterns. By the late 20th century, an emerging field, deep biosphere research, began to suggest that life extended deep below the seafloor itself. Microbes had been found living within rock, metabolizing minerals and hydrogen gas instead of sunlight. If that was true, then the Mariana Trench wasn't just the deepest point on Earth's surface. It might be a gateway into a hidden biosphere, a living underworld stretching miles beneath the crust. At conferences, debates sometimes turned heated. One researcher famously stood and declared, "We keep treating the trench like an end, but what if it's a beginning?" The audience was silent. No one could refute the possibility. And beyond the academic walls, philosophers, theologians, and poets joined the conversation. To them, the trench symbolized the human condition, our endless descent into mystery, our struggle to see through darkness, our courage to keep asking why. As minds divided, one truth held steady. The trench refused to belong to any single story. It was too vast for ownership, too silent for certainty. Science could measure its depth, but not its meaning. Myth could describe its mystery, but not its reality. Between those two poles, data and wonder, humanity found itself suspended, listening for echoes in the black water below. By the end of the 20th century, the Mariana Trench was no longer an unknown chasm. It had been mapped, measured, and sampled. Yet, strangely, it had become more mysterious than ever. The closer scientists looked, the more the abyss seemed to resist understanding, as if it were not merely a place, but a phenomenon, something that existed between what could be seen and what could only be felt. What began as geology was now transforming into something far stranger. In the deepest layers of sediment, researchers began detecting low-frequency vibrations, faint, rhythmic pulses that repeated in long intervals. At first, they were dismissed as minor quakes or distant echoes of storms reverberating through the water. But when the signals continued, precisely timed, perfectly consistent, even in calm weather, the pattern defied explanation. The ocean, it seemed, had a heartbeat. Teams from Japan, the United States, and France installed sensitive hydrophones along the trench's walls, hoping to record the source. The signals were real, deep, rolling waves of sound that travelled through water and rock alike. Some matched known seismic events, others did not. The mysterious pulses seemed to emanate from somewhere far below the measured bottom, beyond where instruments could safely reach. To the scientific mind, this was thrilling. Perhaps they were hearing the slow grind of tectonic plates, the hidden machinery of Earth itself. But for others, there was an eerie poetry to it, a sense that the planet was speaking in vibrations older than life. And then came another discovery. Within samples retrieved from those depths, researchers found bacteria unlike any ever catalogued. They thrived on chemical reactions alone, feeding on hydrogen and carbon from the rocks. These microbes were billions of years old in lineage, perhaps unchanged since the dawn of biology. In them, scientists saw a reflection of Earth's earliest life, and possibly the ancestors of everything living. It was as though the trench had kept a record of creation. This realization shifted the trench from being a geological oddity to something closer to a biological archive. If life began in the ocean, perhaps it had never stopped beginning, hidden within the cracks and pressures where heat and chemistry still met in the dark. The notion unsettled and inspired in equal measure. It meant that the deep sea was not just a remnant of the past, but an active participant in life's ongoing story. Yet, for every new discovery, something inexplicable followed. Submersible cameras occasionally captured flashes of light far below single points of illumination, moving slowly like drifting stars. When reviewed later, the images revealed nothing identifiable, just darkness. Some claimed these were bioluminescent creatures never seen before. Others suspected malfunctions, reflections, or tricks of the current. Still, those who spent long hours listening to the hydrophones swore they could hear faint patterns beyond the seismic hum, sounds too regular, too deliberate, like the echo of distant waves meeting the shore of another world. The Mariana Trench was no longer just a measurement of depth. It had become a philosophical threshold. It reminded humanity that even in an age of satellites and precision, mystery endures. That the more we understand the Earth, the more we realize how little of it we truly know. Some scientists began to call the trench the planet's memory, a place where time moves differently, where the forces that shape the world are still at work, unbothered by surface noise. And if that's true, then every pulse from the deep is a whisper from the beginning, a message in pressure and silence, repeating across eons. The deeper mystery of the Mariana Trench is not just what lies within it, but what it reveals about us. That curiosity, like gravity, always pulls downward. And that perhaps, in listening to the planet's heart, we are hearing something far more profound, the reminder that creation itself never truly ended. It was the dawn of a new century when humanity decided to return to the depths, not as explorers chasing legend, but as scientists seeking truth. The mystery of the trench had grown too vast to ignore. The faint pulses, the alien microbes, the flashes of light in the black, they demanded answers. And so began a new wave of exploration, driven by technology, daring, and something deeper. The quiet hunger to know what lay beneath. In the early 2000s, robotic submersibles replaced the fragile crafts of the past. Machines like Japan's Kaiko, the US, Nereus, and China's Fendouzha were built to endure the crushing pressure of the trench, their titanium hulls thick enough to survive where even light could not. Each descent carried the hopes of nations and the dreams of generations who had looked upon the ocean and wondered. The turning point came in the year 2009, when the Nereus reached the Challenger Deep, nearly 11 kilometers down. It was an unmanned craft, controlled remotely through a cable that stretched for miles through the dark. When its cameras flickered to life, the world saw something few had imagined, a seafloor of fine, undisturbed sediment, alive with faint movement. Tiny crustaceans scuttled across the frame, translucent worms twisted through the mud. The bottom of the world was not dead, it was thriving, quietly, patiently. The data astonished scientists. Chemical analysis revealed high concentrations of methane and ammonia compounds that could sustain life without sunlight. The microbes found there were metabolizing minerals and gases in ways never seen before. They were ancient, efficient, and almost indestructible. Some had genetic structures unlike anything on the surface, suggesting evolutionary branches that had diverged billions of years ago. And yet, the moment of triumph was followed by silence. Months later, the Nereus was lost. The signal vanished during another descent. When fragments of its hull were later recovered floating on the surface, the cause was clear implosion. Somewhere in the black, under immense pressure, the machine had folded inward, erased in an instant. It was a sobering reminder that the deep still demanded respect. The tragedy didn't stop the search. If anything, it deepened the resolve. In 2012, filmmaker and explorer James Cameron made his historic solo dive to the bottom aboard the Deep-Sea Challenger. The descent lasted nearly 7 hours, the return just 70 minutes. When Cameron reached the seafloor, he described it as a desolate lunar plain covered in fine silt that rose and swirled like smoke. He spent 3 hours in that silence, collecting samples and filming the first high-resolution footage of the trench's floor. But what he described afterward was not simply scientific. It was emotional. The silence, he said, was overwhelming, a silence that seemed alive, as if the planet itself were listening. That dive marked a turning point not just for exploration, but for humanity's relationship with the deep. For the first time, the trench was no longer distant myth or mathematical depth. It was a real place visited, touched, recorded, and yet still unfathomable. The data from these missions revealed new details. Strange mineral formations rising like spires, methane vents exhaling ghostly bubbles, and signs of microbial mats that seemed to pulse faintly under light. Some readings hinted at movement beneath the sediment, slow and deliberate, as if the sea floor itself were breathing. Scientists debated the meaning. Some called it tectonic shifting. Others believed it was the rhythmic circulation of fluids within the crust, a geological heartbeat. But to those who had witnessed it, the truth felt larger than science. In that moment, as cameras peered into the black and returned with glimmers of light, humanity saw something reflected in the depths itself. The courage to descend, the fragility of knowledge, and the endless curiosity that drives us to explore even when the unknown stares back in silence. From the first rope lowered by the Challenger to the descent of the Deep-Sea Challenger, the journey had spanned more than a century. And yet, the mystery had only deepened. The ocean had spoken again, not in words, but in pressure, light, and loss. And in its voice, humanity heard both a warning and an invitation. Every descent into the Mariana Trench carried a cost. Some costs were measured in time, some in treasure, and some in silence. The silence of what was lost when the ocean reminded humankind of its strength. The tragedy of the Nereus was only one reminder. The ocean, indifferent and immense, gave knowledge only in exchange for humility. In the years that followed the new age of deep exploration, the consequences began to ripple outward. The discovery that life could thrive at the deepest point on Earth upended more than biology. It challenged philosophy itself. What was life if it could exist without light, without warmth, without anything familiar? Scientists had proven that existence was not fragile but profoundly adaptable, and that revelation shifted the foundation of human understanding. At universities and research institutes, the trench became a symbol of both progress and caution. The press celebrated each new expedition as triumphs of technology. But behind the headlines lay an unspoken tension. Every new dive carried the risk of collapse, of implosion, of failure. Engineers worked in silence, haunted by the knowledge that a single flaw could erase years of effort in a fraction of a second. The cost was also emotional. For the explorers who had looked into the black and returned, something within them changed. James Cameron described it best. It's not just looking into the deep, it's looking into the beginning of everything. Others spoke of a feeling that lingered for months afterward, as if the stillness of the trench had followed them home. They dreamed of weightless descent, of silence pressing against their ears, of faint lights drifting just out of reach. And for those who built and lost their machines to the abyss, the grief was real. The Nereus was more than metal. It was a promise that humanity could reach anywhere, measure anything. Its loss reminded the world that some frontiers remain unconquered, that exploration is never without sacrifice. Yet, beyond the labs and control rooms, another consequence began to take shape. The newfound understanding of deep-sea ecosystems changed how scientists viewed Earth's balance. They discovered that trenches acted as vast recycling systems, swallowing carbon, absorbing heat, stabilizing the planet's climate in ways never understood before. In that sense, the Mariana Trench wasn't just a passive void. It was a living organ in the body of the Earth. But discovery is never isolated. Governments began to show interest in what else the trench might contain: minerals, rare metals, methane hydrates. What had once been a sacred realm of wonder slowly turned into a target of ambition. Proposals emerged to mine the seafloor, to extract wealth from the deep. Scientists warned that disturbing such an ancient ecosystem could have consequences beyond comprehension. Few listened. It was here that the story of discovery began to blur with that of greed. The same curiosity that had led humankind into the unknown now risked transforming it. The deep sea, for all its mystery, had become another frontier to exploit. And the question arose, had we learned nothing from our own history? The Mariana Trench, so far below human reach, became a reflection of the surface world above. Beauty shadowed by hunger, knowledge weighed against consequence. For the first time, scientists and philosophers began to speak not just of exploration, but of stewardship, of what it meant to touch something so ancient without destroying it. The consequence of discovery, it seemed, was not merely knowledge, but responsibility. To know the abyss was to inherit its silence, a silence that asked for restraint. In every story of exploration, there comes a moment when the pursuit of truth must meet the patience of wisdom. For the trench, that moment had arrived. Humanity had finally reached the edge of the known world and found that the price of understanding was learning how to stop. The echoes of discovery travel farther than the sound of any sonar. What began as a single measurement in the 19th century had now reshaped not just science, but humanity's understanding of itself. The Mariana Trench, once a mere depth on a map, had become a living testament to endurance of the planet, of life, and of the curiosity that binds generations together. After each descent, the data spread across continents like ripples on a still pond. Laboratories in Tokyo, London, Washington, and Geneva analyzed samples from the abyss. They found traces of ancient carbon, microfossils older than the first forests, and DNA that hinted at unbroken, evolutionary lines stretching back billions of years. Every fragment of sediment told a piece of Earth's story, a memory buried in darkness, now rising slowly toward the light. The impact of these discoveries reached far beyond oceanography. Astrobiologists began rethinking the possibilities for life beyond Earth. If organisms could thrive in the freezing black of the trench, feeding on minerals and chemical energy alone, then perhaps they could also exist beneath the icy crusts of Europa or Enceladus. The deep sea had become a mirror for the cosmos, reflecting the same question upward. How universal is life's determination to exist? In classrooms around the world, children learned of the trench as more than a geographic fact. They learned it as a symbol of persistence. Documentaries carried the story into homes, where voices whispered over gentle music about the silence 11 kilometers below. Artists painted the abyss as both wound and wonder. Musicians composed symphonies inspired by the rhythm of its currents, and poets wrote of the ocean's invisible cathedral, where life prays in pressure and dark. But the most profound impact was psychological. Humanity, for all its ambition, had glimpsed a place utterly beyond control, and in doing so, rediscovered humility. The trench reminded people that not everything exists for use or understanding. Some things simply are. Their mystery is their meaning. Yet, as the awe spread, so did anxiety. The revelation that the deep ocean played a role in regulating the planet's carbon and temperature introduced a new responsibility. The trench was no longer a silent observer, it was a participant in Earth's balance. Disturbing it through pollution, mining, or neglect might disrupt systems older than humanity itself. Conservation movements began to rise in response. Scientists, once quiet and methodical, now spoke with urgency. They called for protection of deep-sea ecosystems, arguing that to harm of them would be to erase history written not in stone or ink, but in pressure and time. A few governments listened. Marine sanctuaries expanded. International treaties were drafted to safeguard the ocean's most fragile realms. It was a small step, but a vital one, the first recognition that knowledge demands guardianship. Meanwhile, deep-sea technology advanced at an astonishing rate. Autonomous robots replaced tethered submersibles. AI-assisted mapping systems created three-dimensional images of the trench's interior, revealing landscapes that looked almost extraterrestrial, towering cliffs, faulted ridges, and smooth valleys where ancient sediments had settled for eons. What had once been invisible was now rendered in light and data, turning mystery into map, and yet, paradoxically, the more defined it became, the more unknowable it seemed, because no matter how precise the instruments, the essence of the trench, its vast stillness, its timeless pulse could not be captured by machines. Those who studied it often spoke of a quiet reverence, a strange feeling that the abyss was watching back. It was as though the trench had become part of the human soul, a reminder of both our reach and our restraint. Over time, the story of the Mariana Trench became one of connection, between nations, between disciplines, between surface and depth. Its discoveries echoed through science, art, and spirit alike. Every echo carried the same message, that the unknown is not an enemy, but a companion, the silent partner in our endless search for meaning. The trench, once hidden and feared, had transformed into a teacher. Its darkness had become illumination, its silence a voice, and in listening to that voice, humanity had learned one of its most enduring lessons, that discovery does not end when we find the answer. It ends when we stop asking the question. Behind every descent, every charted coordinate, and every fragment of data, there has always been a human heartbeat. Machines may have reached the bottom, but it was human courage that made them possible. The story of the Mariana Trench is not only about the ocean, it is about the people who dared to listen to its silence. Long before the first submersible ever touched the seafloor, there were dreamers, scientists, sailors, engineers, and storytellers who imagined the deep not as a void, but as a world. Their names rarely filled textbooks, yet their persistence shaped history. In the late 19th century, there was Charles Wyville Thomson, who led the HMS Challenger expedition and opened the first window into the abyss. He didn't seek fame. He sought understanding. When his measurements revealed impossible depths, he wrote, we are compelled to accept that we stand on the edge of a world more vast than imagination. Those words still echo in oceanographic institutes today. Decades later came Auguste Piccard, the Swiss physicist who built the first pressurized gondola to explore the stratosphere and then turned his genius downward, designing a vessel to plunge into the sea instead of the sky. He saw no boundary between air and water, only the same desire to reach where no one had gone. His son, Jacques Piccard, carried that legacy into the trench itself, sitting shoulder to shoulder with Don Walsh in a steel sphere barely 2 meters wide. Their descent aboard the Trieste in 1960 was not an act of conquest. It was an act of faith in their calculations, their courage, and the quiet promise that discovery begins where fear ends. Walsh would later say that when they touched bottom, there was no celebration. "We shook hands," he recalled, "and just looked out at the mud. It was enough." Then came others. Scientists who devoted their lives to studying what they might never see with their own eyes, like Dr. Cindy Van Dover, one of the first female submersible pilots, who described the deep as a cathedral without light, or Dr. Douglas Bartlett, who spent decades decoding the genomes of trench microbes, whispering that every sequence of DNA was a story of endurance. And of course, James Cameron, the filmmaker who turned his childhood fascination with the unknown into a real descent into history. He called the trench pure isolation, pure perspective, a place where human ambition met cosmic humility. But beyond the explorers and scientists were the unsung hands, the technicians who built the vessels, the radio operators who guided them, the families who waited on ships above for hours, staring at empty water and hoping to see bubbles rise again. The human story of the Mariana Trench is woven from patience, fear, and love. Love for truth, for adventure, for the fragile beauty of knowing. It is easy to romanticize exploration, to see only triumph and discovery. But those who lived it often describe something quieter, a sense of communion. To stand at the edge of the unknown and feel the deep pull of curiosity is to touch something universal. The same instinct that once led early humans to cross oceans and climb mountains now draws us into the abyss. And in that sense, the Mariana Trench does not just belong to explorers or scientists. It belongs to everyone who has ever looked into darkness and imagined light. It belongs to the child tracing maps with their finger, dreaming of what lies beyond the edge. It belongs to the artist who paints silence, to the thinker who asks why when the world says stop asking. The human element in the story of the trench is not found in the machines or the data. It is found in the fragile, unrelenting will to understand. The same will that carried us to the moon and into the atoms of our own cells. The same will that whispers, still, that there is always something deeper to find. Because exploration, at its heart, is not about distance. It is about intimacy, the closeness between wonder and fear, between knowing and mystery. And for those who have felt the pull of the deep, the greatest discovery is not what lies beneath the sea, but what awakens within the soul when faced with its endlessness. Every great discovery carries its shadow, a chorus of doubt that rises alongside revelation. The deeper humanity ventured into the Mariana Trench, the louder that chorus grew. Scientists called it healthy skepticism, but beneath it lay something older. Fear. Fear of being wrong. Fear of what could not be controlled. Fear of what might look back from the dark. As new expeditions revealed living ecosystems miles below the reach of light, some in the scientific community resisted the implications. They questioned the data, the instruments, even the motives of the explorers. How could life survive under such pressure? How could it thrive without sunlight, without oxygen, without warmth? To believe it was to admit that the rules of life were not what we thought they were. Governments, too, had their doubts, though theirs were rooted less in science and more in strategy. Some nations saw the trench not as a wonder, but as a resource. They wanted proof that it held minerals, gas, or rare metals, not microbes. When research expeditions returned with samples of mud instead of measurable profit, funding began to falter. The deep sea had no votes, no borders, no economy, and so it struggled to find champions. The opposition took subtler forms as well. Some religious leaders warned that humanity was trespassing into realms meant to remain unseen. To explore the abyss, they argued, was to violate the sanctity of creation. The trench became, in their sermons, a metaphor for human arrogance, a reminder that curiosity unchecked could lead to ruin. But even among believers, there were those who saw something divine in the descent. They spoke of the trench not as a forbidden place, but as a cathedral of creation's endurance proof that life persisted even in the absence of light. Thus, the debate between faith and science was not one of opposition, but of reflection. Each side saw the same darkness, but interpreted its silence differently. Meanwhile, environmental advocates clashed with corporate interests. Mining companies proposed drilling near the edges of subduction zones, lured by the promise of rare earth elements. Scientists pleaded for restraint, warning that one careless intrusion could destabilize fragile ecosystems or trigger unpredictable consequences. The trench was no longer just a mystery. It had become a battleground, a symbol of the struggle between greed and guardianship. The tension reached the media. Headlines spoke of conflicting claims beneath the sea, while documentaries framed the argument as a clash of heroes and skeptics. Yet, behind the noise, the truth was quieter. The opposition was not merely external. It lived within each person who sought to understand the trench. Every scientist, every explorer, wrestled with the same question: how far is too far? Those who had looked into the abyss often came back changed. They spoke less of conquest and more of reverence, but their humility did not always translate into policy. To the powerful, the deep was still a resource. To the dreamers, it was still a mystery. The two visions rarely met, and so the opposition endured not as a single voice, but as a persistent echo. It whispered through boardrooms, classrooms, and governments alike. It reminded humanity that discovery demands not only curiosity, but conscience. The Mariana Trench stood at the center of this silent conflict. It could not argue, could not defend itself, could not plead its case. It simply existed, patient, enduring, ancient. It watched as humans debated its worth, as if the value of wonder could be written in numbers or measured in dollars. In time, some began to see the futility of the argument. The trench did not need to be justified. It had been here long before us and would remain long after. The real opposition was not between science and faith, or progress and preservation. It was between arrogance and awe, between the desire to own and the courage to understand. And that battle, perhaps, will never truly end. Every discovery passes through 3 stages: disbelief, understanding, and awakening. The Mariana Trench had travelled that path across a century and a half, from myth to measurement, from fear to fascination. But now, something deeper began to take hold. Humanity was no longer just studying the trench, it was listening to it. The awakening began quietly, not in laboratories or conference halls, but in hearts. Explorers, engineers, and scientists who had devoted their lives to the deep started to speak differently. They no longer described the trench as an obstacle or an adversary. They called it a teacher, a silent one, patient and vast, whose lessons arrived not through words, but through reflection. Dr. Robert Stern, a marine geologist, once said after years of studying subduction zones, "The deeper I look, the more the Earth feels alive." It wasn't metaphor, it was realization. Beneath all the measurements, the temperature readings, sonar maps, and chemical equations lay something that felt conscious in its own slow geological way. The planet wasn't inert. It pulsed, shifted, and adapted just as living organisms do. The trench was not a scar, it was a breath. This awareness changed the language of exploration. Where scientists once spoke of conquest, they began to speak of communion. Missions were designed not only to gather data but to do no harm. The tone of inquiry softened. The deeper the machines went, the more reverence replaced ambition. In schools, teachers began to frame the trench not merely as geography, but as philosophy. It became a metaphor for humility, for the vastness within and without. Children were taught that curiosity was sacred, but so was care. The trench became a story of balance between knowledge and restraint, courage and respect, progress and preservation. The awakening spread through art and imagination as well. Writers described the abyss as the planet's heartbeat. Composers crafted symphonies built around the rhythm of sonar echoes and deep-sea vibrations. Painters, inspired by images of the glowing snailfish and ghostly amphipods, created works that shimmered with blue and silver light. Even the silence of the trench became a kind of music, a reminder that not all truth is spoken. Yet, perhaps the most profound awakening came when humanity began to see itself reflected in the ocean's depths. The trench was no longer distant, it was a mirror. Its darkness reminded us of the unknown within our own minds, the fears, the dreams, the questions that drive us forward. The abyss outside and the abyss within had become one. Philosophers called it the return of awe. For centuries, progress had made the world smaller. Satellites mapped every coastline, planes crossed oceans in hours, and the stars themselves had been photographed. But the Mariana Trench returned scale to existence. It reminded us that mystery still lived among us, not only in galaxies far away, but in the water beneath our feet. Even faith traditions began to shift. Theologians wrote of the deep as sacred geography, not a place of punishment or chaos, but of creation continuing in silence. Life, it seemed, did not need light to exist. It needed persistence, and in that persistence many found a kind of grace. Scientists began to notice a subtle change in themselves as well. Those who had spent decades studying the trench reported an odd sense of calm. The data was complex, but the feeling was simple. Connection. They felt part of something enormous and ongoing, the slow breathing of a planet, the shared pulse of life across time. The awakening of the Mariana Trench was not an event, but a shift, a turning inward. It taught humanity that discovery is not about dominance, it is about relationship. To know the world is to respect it, to learn from it, to walk gently across its surface and listen when it speaks through tide and tremor. The trench had begun as an impossible depth. It had become a symbol of endurance, then a source of conflict, and finally an oracle of humility. Its silence had transformed knowledge into wisdom. And perhaps that is what the abyss has always been waiting for. Not to be conquered, but to be understood. There are moments in the history of exploration when data becomes meaning, when numbers turn into something that feels like revelation. The Mariana Trench had given humankind countless measurements, countless readings of pressure and temperature, but now it began to give something greater. The discoveries that emerged from its depths in the 21st century revealed not only what the world was made of, but what it meant to be part of it. It began with the microbes. Genetic sequencing of trench-dwelling organisms revealed something astonishing. Their DNA contained similarities to life found in volcanic vents, polar ice, and deep within the crust itself. The implication was staggering. All life, from the surface to the seafloor, shared an unbroken thread of ancestry. The trench was not a separate world. It was the hidden root of the same tree that had produced everything that breathes and moves above. But there was more. In the chemical composition of the seafloor mud, scientists found traces of ancient organic matter, remnants of life from hundreds of millions of years ago, compressed by time and tectonic movement into a kind of biological fossil record. When analyzed, these fragments showed that the trench was constantly consuming and renewing life, breaking it down and returning it to the planet's cycle. The deepest place on Earth was not an end, but a beginning, the eternal recycler of existence. It was here that the revelation took form. The trench was not simply a place where the Earth folded in on itself. It was the breathing mechanism of the planet. Every earthquake, every slow grind of rock against rock was part of a heartbeat, a pulse that kept continents alive. What humanity had thought of as static stone was, in truth, living rhythm. That realization rippled through every field of study. Geologists began to speak of the Earth not as a dead sphere of minerals, but as a dynamic, self-regulating organism. Biologists saw continuity, the same chemical symphony playing in deep-sea bacteria and human blood. Philosophers wrote that the trench was not below us, but within us, a metaphor for the unknown depths of consciousness itself. And perhaps that was the greatest revelation of all. That the planet and the mind mirrored each other. Both held darkness, both created life from pressure, and both needed balance to survive. The revelation also came with a quiet humility. For centuries, humanity had sought to rise, to build higher, to reach farther, to conquer gravity itself. But now, from the very bottom of the world, came a lesson that ascension and descent were the same path in reverse. To rise high, one must first understand the depths. To know the light, one must listen to the dark. In this understanding, the Mariana Trench ceased to be just a location. It became a symbol of equilibrium, a reminder that even at the edge of crushing weight, life persists. Even where light cannot reach, meaning still forms. Explorers who had once descended for science now spoke of the experience as spiritual. One described it as standing inside the planet's memory. Another said, "Down there, you realize that the Earth is not below us, we are inside it." Their words were not technical, but tender. The abyss had stopped being a frontier to conquer and had become a place of communion. And so, humanity began to shift its gaze once again, not upward to escape the planet, but inward to understand it. The revelation of the trench had rewired curiosity itself. Discovery was no longer about possession, it was about participation. In that revelation lay the deepest truth the ocean could offer, that the universe does not separate itself into above and below, known and unknown, life and death. Everything moves in cycles. Everything is one. The trench had always known this. It had whispered it through currents, murmured it through vibrations, and carved it into the bones of the earth. Humanity simply needed to listen long enough to hear. After the revelation came stillness, the kind of silence that follows understanding, when there is nothing left to prove, only to feel. For those who had spent decades chasing the mysteries of the Mariana Trench, this stillness felt like coming home. The questions had not all been answered, but the pursuit itself had changed shape. It was no longer about conquering the unknown, it was about coexisting with it. In that silence, humanity began to see itself reflected in the abyss. The trench was no longer just an external place, somewhere far beneath the waves. It became a mirror, a reminder that we, too, contain depths unseen, pressures unmeasured, and quiet currents of thought that move beneath the surface of our minds. For centuries, the ocean had symbolized chaos, mystery, and danger. But now, as scientists, artists, and philosophers turned their gaze inward, the trench transformed into a metaphor for peace, for the hidden strength in stillness, for the beauty of what endures in darkness. Those who studied its ecosystems noticed something profound. Balance. Every organism, from glowing microbes to ghostly snailfish, existed in perfect equilibrium with its environment. Nothing wasted, nothing excess. Life in the trench was not about growth or competition. It was about harmony. It thrived not despite the pressure, but because of it. That truth resonated beyond science. In a world driven by speed, expansion, and noise, the trench offered an opposing lesson. That depth requires patience, that silence is a kind of wisdom, and that not all growth is visible. It was as if the earth itself was offering counsel to slow down, to breathe, to remember that stillness is not emptiness, but space for meaning to form. Writers began to call this the deep reflection. They saw in the trench the same paradox that lives in every human heart, that the darkest places can hold the most enduring light. Meditation teachers used images of the abyss to describe inner calm, guiding their students to imagine drifting slowly downward, letting go of the surface noise of thought, until only stillness remained. In this way, the Mariana Trench became a bridge between science and soul. Its measurements spoke of distance and pressure, but its silence spoke of peace. Those who listened closely realized that the ocean's deepest point was not frightening at all. It was gentle. It was patient. It was timeless. Oceanographer Dr. Catherine Sullivan, the first woman to reach the Challenger Deep, described it simply, "Down there, you feel the pulse of the planet, and it feels like your own." Her words captured what countless explorers had felt, but could not express that connection between the human heart and the Earth's, both beating quietly in the dark. And perhaps that is the final reflection, that our search for the unknown is never truly outward. The oceans, the stars, the atoms, they are mirrors reflecting the same endless question back at us. What are we a part of? What sustains us? What are we becoming? When we look into the trench, we are really looking into ourselves. The silence we find there is not absence, but invitation, an open space where wonder lives without the need for answers. In the reflection of the abyss, humanity found something it had long forgotten in its rush toward progress: reverence. Reverence for the fragility of life, for the patience of nature, and for the beauty of not knowing. The great paradox of discovery is that it always leads us back to humility. And perhaps that is the truest wisdom of the Mariana Trench, that when we finally stop trying to measure everything, we begin to understand. The legacy of the Mariana Trench is not carved in stone or written in ink. It moves quietly, like current through deep water, shaping generations without ever demanding recognition. What the abyss gave humanity was not just knowledge, it was perspective. And perspective endures longer than any discovery. In the decades since the first descent, the trench has continued to influence every field of human thought. Engineers design pressure-resistant materials by studying its physics. Biologists study its microbes to understand the resilience of life. Astronomers use its models to imagine how alien ecosystems might endure in frozen oceans beyond Earth. Even climate scientists look to it for clues. For the trench does not only hold secrets, it helps regulate the planet's heartbeat. Beneath the surface, the trench absorbs carbon, buries it, and keeps it from returning to the atmosphere. It balances temperature, stores heat, and quiets chaos. In this way, the deepest abyss has always been a quiet guardian of life above. Humanity, for all its ambition, had overlooked this for centuries, that the unseen often sustains the seen. The legacy of those who explored it lives on too. The descendants of explorers like Don Walsh and Jacques Picard still speak of the courage it took to descend into silence with nothing but trust in steel and mathematics. Their stories have become legends not of heroism, but of humility. In classrooms, their names are spoken alongside those of astronauts. Not because they went far, but because they went deep and came back changed. Museums around the world now display fragments of the Trieste, the Deep-Sea Challenger, and the Kaiko. Children press their hands against the glass and stare at those tiny portholes, the eyes through which humanity first looked into infinity. To them, the trench is not a place of fear. It is a symbol of wonder, proof that mystery still belongs to this world. In literature and art, the trench has become myth again, but this time a benevolent one. Poets write of its stillness as prayer. Painters capture its blue-black gradients as if they were moods of the planet itself. Composers craft movements around the slow rhythm of sonar pings, echoing through miles of water. The abyss, once the domain of monsters, has become the sanctuary of reflection. The legacy also reshaped how humanity approaches exploration. The era of extraction slowly gave way to the era of protection. Where once we sought to take from the unknown, we now learn to guard it. Nations began declaring marine protected zones, and the idea of deep-time stewardship preserving what we cannot yet understand took hold among scientists. The trench had taught us that curiosity without care is not discovery, but destruction. And perhaps the most lasting legacy of all lies in the silence it left behind. For every explorer who returned from the depths spoke of the same thing, a profound, almost sacred quiet. They carried that stillness home with them into their lives, their work, their way of seeing. It changed how they spoke, how they moved, how they thought about the world. They no longer chased answers, they listened for them. That quiet legacy has spread far beyond the sea. In meditation centers, in classrooms, in late-night conversations under the stars, people speak of the abyss as if it were an inner space. The words Mariana Trench no longer evoke danger, but depth, a reminder that the human spirit, like the earth, holds infinite layers still waiting to be explored. Every great discovery leaves behind a choice, the choice of what to do with what we have learned. The trench has given us that choice in its own way, to see the world not as a collection of resources, but as a living continuum of wonder. The legacy of the abyss is not its depth, nor its darkness. It is its patience. It has waited millions of years to be seen, and even now it reveals itself slowly, carefully, to those who approach with respect. It teaches us that mystery is not a void to fill, but a promise to keep. And so, long after the explorers are gone, long after the machines have rusted and the recordings have faded, the trench remains steady and silent, its lessons still moving through the tides of time. Time, like the sea, moves in layers. What we call history is merely the shallow tide, while deep beneath it, the great currents of meaning continue to flow. The story of the Mariana Trench, of its discovery, exploration, and understanding, has now joined those deep currents. It has become more than an event. It has become an echo, one that continues to shape the human journey long after the last submersible light faded into the dark. Every civilization has looked upward to the stars for guidance, yet the trench reminds us that wisdom also waits below. Just as ancient astronomers once charted constellations to understand their place in the cosmos, modern explorers of the deep have charted silence itself and found it to be just as infinite. The echo of their discoveries travels not only through science, but through time. It whispers to those who come after that to explore is to remember, and to remember is to belong. In some distant future, when our satellites have mapped every corner of the solar system and our descendants drift among the moons of Jupiter, the story of the trench will remain a touchstone. The first time humanity truly confronted the depths of its own planet and saw itself reflected there. For even in the age of the stars, the lesson of the abyss will endure, that every height mirrors a depth, and every act of reaching outward must be balanced by a descent within. The echo also lives in the continuity of life itself. Microbes collected from the trench now orbit above the Earth in laboratories aboard the International Space Station, used in experiments to study survival in vacuum and radiation. Tiny passengers of the abyss, once buried under crushing tons of water, now float among the stars. The circle completes itself, life that began in darkness helping us reach into the light. But the echo is not just biological, it is philosophical. The trench has become a parable of perspective. In an age where progress often outpaces reflection, it reminds us that depth cannot be rushed, that silence is not absence, but meaning still forming. That wonder, once awakened, must be tended gently, like a fragile flame in the wind of endless discovery. Generations of storytellers have carried this echo forward. They speak of the abyss as an ancient eye, half closed, half awake, watching civilizations rise and fall with the patience of geology. They say it remembers everything, the weight of ships, the tremors of earthquakes, the long slow drift of continents. And though it does not speak in language, its memory lingers in every wave, every whisper of tide against shore. It is humbling to realize that the trench, older than humanity, will also outlast it. Long after our cities crumble and our machines go silent, the abyss will remain dark, immense, and alive. And yet, something of us will remain there too. Our probes, our instruments, our stories etched into the data we left behind. Even our smallest creations will become sediment in its walls, joining the planet's long memory. The trench will remember us, as it remembers everything. This is the echo beyond time, the truth that discovery is not a conquest, but a conversation. The abyss listened when we arrived. Now we must listen in return, for it teaches a timeless balance, that the further we reach, the deeper we must root. that the wisdom of the stars begins with the humility of the sea. And so, the echo continues across generations, across eras, across silence. It travels through the currents of thought, through the imaginations of dreamers, through the songs of whales and the hum of sonar. It speaks softly but endures longer than any voice. Remember where you came from. Remember how small you are and how infinite you belong to be. Night falls quietly over the ocean. The horizon fades into a soft blur where sky and sea become one endless shade of blue-black. Somewhere far beneath, in a depth that light has never touched, the Mariana Trench rests silent, unbothered, eternal. And above it, humanity continues to dream. This is where our journey circles back to its beginning, the meeting point between the infinite above and the infinite below. We once looked to the heavens to ask who we are, and then we looked into the abyss to ask the same. Now, we understand. Both questions are the same. The universe is not separated into sky and sea. It is one continuum of mystery, flowing endlessly through scale and silence. The trench taught us that even the most desolate places are alive, that silence has texture, that darkness has depth, and that meaning often waits where we are least willing to look. It showed us that the unknown is not an enemy, but a teacher, one that asks nothing more than our patience and wonder. And perhaps, as we gaze into the stars tonight, we might realize something profound, that the stars and the sea are reflections of each other. Both shimmer with the light of things long past. Both hold secrets that stretch beyond the reach of our senses. Both invite us to listen. The difference is only direction. One calls us upward, the other inward. Imagine for a moment that you are drifting above the earth, suspended between gravity and freedom. Below, the ocean glows faintly in moonlight. Above, constellations unfold like ancient stories written across eternity. Between them, there is you, a fragment of awareness, breathing in the quiet rhythm of creation. You are not apart from it. You are part of its balance. In this stillness, we remember that every question we've ever asked of the sea, the stars, or ourselves is really the same question. What does it mean to exist? The Mariana Trench did not give us the answer, but it gave us something better, the courage to keep asking. The stars, too, whisper the same invitation, to keep looking, to keep listening, to keep wondering. As the final echoes of this journey fade, we leave behind the abyss not with fear, but with gratitude. For in its darkness we found light, in its silence we found voice, in its depths we found ourselves. And so, as our minds drift gently back to the surface, to the warmth of home and air, let us carry the lesson of the trench with us, that wonder is not a destination, but a way of seeing, that awe is not found in distance, but in presence. The deep sea will continue its slow breathing beneath the waves, just as the stars will continue their silent burn above. Between them, the story of humanity will unfold fragile, brief, yet luminous. And perhaps, in some distant future, another voice will speak across time, telling of how we once descended into the planet's heart and returned changed. Until then, let us keep listening to both silence and starlight. Let us remember that to explore is to love, and to love is to endure. Good night, traveller of the deep. May your dreams drift softly between ocean and cosmos. May your thoughts settle like sand in the stillness of understanding. And when you wake, May you carry with you the quiet truth of all discovery that everything, from the deepest trench to the farthest star, is part of one great breathing story.